She was humiliated as two white officers planted fake evidence, shattering her career as a black attorney fighting for justice. But when the truth unraveled, and she became the judge presiding over their fate, everything changed. What happened next will shock you. Let's start from the beginning. Melanie Johnson walked briskly through the quiet streets, her worn briefcase bumping gently against her hip. The late-night air was cool, carrying faint sounds of the city in the distance. Her dark, curly hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and her sharp, determined eyes scanned her surroundings as she replayed the events of another long day at the legal aid clinic. She had spent hours counseling clients who had no one else to turn to, offering not only her legal expertise, but a sense of hope in a system stacked against them. Her modest suit, though slightly wrinkled from the day's efforts, reflected her professionalism and pride in her work, even as exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. As Melanie turned the corner toward her modest apartment, the sudden glare of red and blue lights startled her, momentarily blinding her vision. A police car idled at the curb, and two white officers stepped out, their expressions cold and authoritative. Detectives Harris and Blake approached with calculated precision, their presence bristling with intimidation. "Stop right there," Harris barked, his tone sharp enough to make Melanie freeze. Confused, she raised her hands instinctively, trying to maintain composure. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, her voice steady but wary. "You match the description of a suspect," Blake said, his hand hovering near his holster. Before Melanie could process the accusation, Harris demanded to search her bag. As she protested her innocence, the tension escalated. Harris pulled out a wallet, triumphantly holding it aloft. "This was reported stolen," he declared, ignoring Melanie's shocked denial. Within moments, Melanie found herself roughly handcuffed, her wrists aching against the cold steel. A small crowd gathered, their murmurs growing as they recognized her face. A lawyer, a community advocate, now paraded as a criminal. The humiliation was palpable, and tears stung her eyes as she met their judgmental stares. Unbeknownst to her, this was no coincidence. Harris and Blake, notorious for fabricating evidence, had chosen her as their latest target, betting that her voice would be drowned by their badges. But Melanie's resolve, though shaken, was far from broken. This was only the beginning. Melanie sat on the cold bench of her jail cell, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering above her. The metallic clang of doors echoed through the silence, but her thoughts were louder. Her mind raced with legal strategies, scenarios, and questions, each one colliding with the raw reality of her situation. As a lawyer, she knew the grim statistics. Cases like hers were often dismissed without a second glance. The system was not designed for people like her to win. But as despair clawed at the edges of her resolve, another feeling began to solidify, a fierce determination to fight back. By morning, Melanie was exhausted but clear-headed. Her best friend, Keisha, arrived with fire in her eyes, offering both moral support and practical help. "They messed with the wrong one," Keisha said, gripping Melanie's hand. Together, they contacted Melanie's former law professor, Dr. Charles Hargrove, a seasoned litigator with connections in the legal and media world. Dr. Hargrove agreed to co-sign her bail, vowing to help her uncover the truth. Back home, Melanie transformed her small living room into a war room. Legal pads, case files, and her laptop covered every available surface. She began researching Harris and Blake, combing through police reports, and reaching out to people who had been targeted. The stories she uncovered were chilling. Black residents accused of fabricated crimes, coerced confessions, and planted evidence. She documented each case meticulously, knowing that every detail could be pivotal. Melanie also reached out to local journalists, providing them with her findings and highlighting the systemic abuse these officers perpetuated. The first article about her case hit the internet like wildfire, sparking outrage. Soon, a video of her arrest surfaced, shared by someone in the crowd that night. The footage was damning, showing Harris pulling the wallet from his own pocket. Social media became her megaphone. Hashtags like #justice for Melanie and #expose Harris and Blake trended overnight. Protests erupted outside the police station, with signs demanding accountability. Melanie watched the crowds grow, feeling the power of collective outrage fuel her fight. What began as a personal battle was now a movement, and she was ready to lead it to justice. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the weight of the case palpable in every corner. Harris and Blake sat rigidly at the defendant's table, their confident expressions betraying faint cracks of unease. Across the room, Melanie sat beside her legal team, her posture straight and her gaze steady, though her hands clutched a pen tightly enough to leave imprints. She had prepared for this moment with meticulous care, her defense crafted with precision and fueled by a relentless determination to expose the truth. The prosecution presented its narrative, painting Melanie as a thief caught red-handed. Harris and Blake confidently recounted their version of events, embellishing every detail to paint themselves as diligent officers of the law. The room seemed split. Some members of the audience furrowed their brows in doubt, while others nodded in agreement, their biases clouding their judgment. But Melanie's team was ready. Piece by piece, they dismantled the officer's fabricated story. The pivotal moment came when security footage from the convenience store where the alleged theft took place was presented. The video, crisp and undeniable, showed Melanie nowhere near the location during the time of the incident. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by hushed whispers. Harris and Blake visibly stiffened, their confident facade beginning to crumble. Then came the whistleblower, a brave officer from within the department, emboldened by the mounting public pressure. He testified about the officer's history of fabricating evidence and presented damning emails and internal reports. The courtroom erupted as the judge sternly silenced the murmurs. Harris and Blake's lawyer attempted to object, but the damage was done. As the judge struck her gavel, declaring the charges against Melanie dismissed, a wave of emotion surged through the room. Applause erupted despite courtroom decorum, the audience unable to contain their relief and outrage. The judge announced an internal investigation into the police department, and Harris and Blake were suspended on the spot. Melanie stepped outside the courthouse to a crowd of supporters chanting her name, their signs demanding reform. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, she knew the fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning of her quest for justice. Years later, Melanie's career soared. Her experience lit a fire in her, driving her to advocate for justice reform. She became a renowned civil rights attorney and eventually ran for a judgeship, winning with overwhelming support. Her first high-profile case as a judge, overseeing an appeal from Harris and Blake, who were now facing felony charges for their corruption. The irony was not lost on the courtroom, as the once dominant officers now stood humiliated before the woman they had tried to destroy. Melanie presided with fairness, ensuring their rights were upheld, but the evidence against them was irrefutable. Both were sentenced to prison, their careers and reputations in ruins. In her chambers that evening, Melanie reflected on her journey. Her rise from a falsely accused victim to a symbol of justice was not just her triumph, but a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced. The scales of justice, once tipped against her, now balanced firmly in her hands.